Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein, here with Patricia Murphy at the state capitol and Tia Mitchell joining us remotely from Washington. Hey, guys.
Hey, Greg.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Tia.
Well, welcome to a brand new phase of Georgia's campaign season. The Republican ticket is set. The Democratic ticket is set. And now we're seeing the first real signs of what both sides think this election is going to be about. For Republicans, the message has been what the Democratic message has been in the marquee races for the last month. That is unity, but that's not always easy. The challenge is turning that into turnout. And for Brian Kemp, the question is what happens to his political machine now that voters rejected his favorite candidates in two of the biggest Republican runoffs this year. And then for Republicans in general, it's portraying that sense of unity. Let's start with the Georgia GOP Rodeo Fundraiser in Perry, guys. This was not your old school Buckhead ballroom fundraiser that we've all covered. It was barrel racing and bronco riding and calf roping, and a very deliberate attempt by the state party to say, this is a different Republican Party. Josh McCoon's message from the stage was basically one team, one mission, one Republican ticket. But the guest list tells another story. Senate candidate Mike Collins was there. Congressman Rich McCormick and Austin Scott were there. Former Governor Sonny Perdue, he was there. But Rick Jackson, the newly minted Republican nominee for governor, he was not there, citing a scheduling conflict. Neither was Chris Carr, the Attorney General, or John King, the Insurance Commissioner. Those are also two of Jackson's closest allies. So the question was this a unity event or a reminder that Republican unity in Georgia is still very much a work in progress? Patricia, what do you make of it?
I'd say it's a work in progress for sure. And obviously this event was planned well before they knew that Rick Jackson would be the nominee. If you meet Rick Jackson, he does not exude, let's go to a rodeo.
He could buy one.
He could buy a million rodeos, probably. He could certainly stage his own rodeo in his own backyard. He's got that big of a backyard. But I do believe and I do know that there is some work to do, especially at the top of the Republican Party, for Rick Jackson to first decide if he wants to mend fences with some sitting members of the legislature. And then if he does want to do that, there will be some outreach that he needs to do. But it's so fascinating because Rick Jackson, it's not just about the legislature, it's sort of about the GOP writ large, because although Rick Jackson has always been involved in politics to the extent that he was down here at the Capitol lobbying on foster care, he was well known to many people. He's not been a fixture of the GOP, and he ran as a vocal, aggressive outsider of the system, saying that the entire system is a cabal, and people are in it for themselves. They're in it for the lobbyists. They're not in it for the people of Georgia. And that, in the process, implicated a number of people who were at that rodeo. So they've got to decide how they're going to work with Jackson, and Jackson's got to decide how they're going to work with him.
Yeah, Tia, it's interesting. This, by the way, was my first rodeo. It was very cool. It went on for a little longer than I thought. I had to leave before the bulls, but I got to see some of the Broncos and the barrel racing and all the amazing feats of horsemanship. This was like a world-class event. They brought in a rodeo company, and all these folks were national ranked, so it was neat. Not a huge turnout, but it was also a huge arena. So the pictures I took kind of went mini viral.
How many people, Greg? It looked like 3 people were there. How many people? It was
probably more like 700 to maybe 1,200. Oh, okay. But this was a 7,000 or so seat arena. Yeah. So it was a big arena in Perry, Georgia. But Tia, it also reminds me of some of the backlash that we covered so intensely with Governor Kemp and his infighting with the Republican Party of Georgia, when he said essentially it was no secret that the chairman at that time, David Schaefer, was a supporter of not just Donald Trump, but also some of the Trump-backed loyalists who were challenging Kemp and his allies in that election. So the governor said, you know what, I'm going to go and create my own system. And that's how we have leadership committees in Georgia that allow the top candidates to kind of circumvent and do what the party used to do. Rick Jackson doesn't need a leadership committee. I mean, he's going to benefit from one too. He has one now that he's the nominee. But he could fund his own apparatus. He can fund his own get out the vote machinery. But you also still see that Senate nominee Mike Collins and other Republicans on the ticket, of course, don't have that same fundraising and donation and financial firepower.
Yeah, Greg. I mean, first of all, I think we should say this rodeo event in Perry, it was your first rodeo, but it was also the Georgia GOP's first rodeo. It was their first time doing something like this as a signature fundraiser. It was branded along with the America 250 celebration. But I think they ran into something, I think particularly the Republican Party doesn't like admitting that Atlanta is the center of the Georgia political universe because it represents, the Democratic base. And I think so symbolically, they were, holding this fundraiser away from Metro Atlanta, appealing to some of their base in more rural areas. But that's not where the people with the deep pockets are. That's not, Perry's down there in West Georgia. It's not where a lot of the people live. So to me, that explains why they may not have had as big of a crowd as perhaps they might have had if they had it kind of closer to one of the larger cities. But to your point, Mike Collins, we knew he was going to be there. It was going to be kind of his first public appearance since winning the runoff. And you're right. He does need to make those connections because Mike Collins does need to raise money. He needs to raise a lot of money. And quite frankly, he criticizes Jon Ossoff, Senator Ossoff, the incumbent that he hopes to take out for raising money across the country, says that shows that he's listening to the coastal elites and not the people of Georgia. But guess what Mike Collins is going to be doing? Raising money from across the country because he's got to, be able to match Ossoff. And he's only going to be able to do that if he creates a national donor base, but he's got to start local with his Georgia people. I do find it interesting, to you guys' point, that Rick Jackson, I know he cited a scheduling conflict, but at the end of the day, you are now the nominee to be governor of the state of Georgia, and this is your party's signature event, a huge fundraiser, and you own your own planes, which means scheduling conflicts only exist if you allow them to. You know what I mean? For the most part. Because it's not like if he had a dinner somewhere or was fundraising somewhere, he can get wherever he wants to go quickly. Yeah. And so, again, I don't know, maybe this was like a wedding or a family vacation that he truly could not miss. But I just, I think what we're getting at is, was this truly a conflict or just something where he decided he didn't want to go or wasn't ready to go?
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that, the relations, there's certainly a lot of Rick Jackson allies who see the state party and not just Chairman McComb, but also the folks in the upper echelons of the state party is very close with Burt Jones, right?
Yes.
And you'd see a lot of those activists at Burt Jones's events, not just near the end of the campaign, but early in the campaign, particularly long before Rick Jackson was in the race, when it was Jones versus Brad Raffensperger and Chris Carr, they were lining up behind. Even if they didn't say it out loud, there was a sense that a lot of these key activists who make up the upper ranks of the state party were lining up behind Burt Jones as the best candidate, who fits mostly more aligned with their values. And Patricia, like in the end, did Governor Kemp clashing with the state party matter in his 2022 election? No, he won anyway. For Rick Jackson, is he going to be too worried about his relations with the state party? Look, there's an argument that he doesn't need to worry about it at all. And then I've heard from some key activists that he should be worried about it because this is a different sort of race. And you're going to need not just the votes from these activists, but these are the folks who wake up early on Saturday mornings and they go knock on the doors and they phone bank and they do the text banking. They're the ones who aren't just the activists who vote, but they are the ones who power the backbones of these campaigns.
Yeah, I'd say a much more important place where we know Rick Jackson was recently was with Donald Trump at Trump National. As long as he has a good relationship with President Trump, and it certainly looks like that relationship is very strong. The president tweeted about him moments after he won on election night, even though the president had endorsed Burt Jones. I think his relationship with the president is much much more important than his relationship with the state party, because the state party will do what the president wants them to do. And I think that they will maybe see past their differences with Rick Jackson if there are any reasons that they have still left over from the primary, not to be working all out for him. But as you said, as Governor Kemp has proven, you cannot rely. Not only can you live without the state party, you absolutely cannot rely on the state party to fund your operation, run your operation, get out your votes, because the Georgia state GOP has not done that properly in the past, sometimes by choice, sometimes by just it's too much to do for a party to stand up an election like that. So he's going to have his own operation. He's going to need his own operation. And I think the Georgia GOP will realize that he's obviously their best chance to win in November because he's their nominee. So I would see this falling to the wayside pretty soon here.
Great. Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk more about how President Trump has reacted to his biggest, well, if not his biggest, one of his biggest losses this 2026 election cycle, and that is the endorsement of Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who lost to Rick Jackson. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. A reminder, if you've got a question you'd like to ask us here on the show, you can call our hotline anytime, day or night, leave a question, and we'll play it back and answer it right here on the show during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. You can also email us, politicallygeorgia, all one word, at ajc.com. Okay, Tia, before the runoff, one of the biggest surprises in Georgia politics was Brian Kemp's decision to endorse Burt Jones over Rick Jackson in the Republican race for governor. Also, in the same contest, we had Donald Trump endorsing Mike Collins over Derek Dooley the same day. It was a momentous Sunday right before the runoff. After Rick Jackson's victory, though, Donald Trump, he declared victory too. He did not seem to take Burt Jones's loss too much to heart. I'm going to read you from his social media post, posted just a few hours after that runoff. Quote, Rick Jackson ran a great Trump campaign, very smart, was with me on Saturday night making a pitch, amazing. He won against a great guy, Burt Jones, who has a fantastic future, President DJT. So, Tia, are we surprised at all that Donald Trump, even though he endorsed Burt Jones, lost that race, that he's also sort of claiming partial credit for Rick Jackson?
Yeah, not surprised at all, because we know that Donald Trump likes to bet on winners and pick winners. And there's a part of him that now is latching on to Rick Jackson because he's the winner. And I think it doesn't hurt that Rick Jackson worked really hard. Not necessarily, Trump had already endorsed Burt Jones, as we all know, before Rick Jackson even announced he was running for governor. But what's clear is that Rick Jackson worked hard to try to change Trump's mind, get him to either double endorse, which Trump has done in some of the elections on the ballot this year, said, I like this guy, but I also like this girl or this guy too. So I think Rick Jackson had worked hard to build a relationship with Donald Trump, try to get his endorsement. Ultimately, Trump did not double endorse or say, he said nice things about Rick Jackson, but he made it clear before the runoff that he was still with Burt Jones. Burt Jones was his chosen candidate. But once his chosen candidate did not win, he's more vocal in saying, but I also think Rick Jackson's a great guy. Mm-hmm. And he is right that Rick Jackson did run a very, Trump-focused campaign, said all the right things about supporting what Trump is doing and wanting to back up those policies if he were elected governor.
Yeah, I mean, but Patricia, how much is the Trump factor even going to matter in a race like this? I mean, it could if Trump was against you, right? And it could alienate the base. But in this race, it was not there was not in any of these races, really. There was never like a sort of a never Trumper candidate who represented a clear, distinctly ideological difference in terms of the Trump policy. Even Brad Raffensperger, Chris Carr, you name it, they all said they embraced the president and his agenda. Rarely, Chris Carr was probably the candidate who spoke out most frequently against very limited, very specific Trump policies like lawfare. Uh-huh. But in general, most candidates really did hew towards Trump.
Yeah, that's sort of the baseline at this point is I support President Trump and just about anything he does. And any candidate who hewed away from that in this election cycle, like Chris Carr, really paid the price. Now, will Rick Jackson's support of the president matter? I think it will matter quite a bit because President Trump is essential to getting out those Republican base voters. And you can try and run without the president, but I think in this particular year, it feels like Georgia Republican voters have made up their mind. They support the president. They support people who support the president. And anyone who diverges from that is a good enough reason to stay home. You're not going to vote for the Democrat, but you're not going to come out and vote at all. I think Rick Jackson's going to have a balancing act to do because he needs people who voted for the president and some other people to vote for him. And Jon Ossoff and Keisha Lance Bottoms are going to be driving the message every day that the Republicans are President Trump. They're nothing but Trump puppets. And because the president has such high negatives here in the state, Jackson's going to have to find a third lane to be able to both be supportive of the president and also appeal to those independents who maybe they like the president, maybe they don't. He'll need to run his race on Keisha Lance Bottoms' record in that case. And I think find a way to get that group of people in the middle who aren't necessarily Trump voters, but who he needs anyway.
Yeah, Tia, those are we call them, the past cycles we've called them the Kemp Warnock voters. Those are the split ticket voters that have really powered the last 3 or 4 election cycles in Georgia. This cycle, we can maybe call them the Ossoff Jackson voters, or who knows, right? They could be the Collins Bottoms voters. They could be just the Carr Raffensperger voters. I mean, they could be the folks who voted for more mainstream Republicans who might be more up in the air in this cycle. Mike Collins, we've already seen him. You've written about this. We've already seen him. He's not going to disavow the president, but we've already seen him talk more about results, about, he's the guy who gets...
Partisanship.
Yeah. Rick Jackson, we're going to see. But I think he's going to lean more heavily on his background.
Yeah, I think the top 4, Bottoms, Jackson, Collins, Ossoff, all 4 of them, once they became the party nominee, started really focusing on their backstory, their origin story, to make themselves more relatable to voters and try to connect with voters on, I think, a more personal level. And I think that's interesting that we've seen it from both the nominees for governor and Senate. For Rick Jackson, it's going to be really interesting because, yes, as a former foster child who grew up in public housing and things like that, he has a very powerful story. At the end of the day, he is a very wealthy man in ways that his current lifestyle does not reflect a lot of the people who say they're struggling in the current economy. So he's going to have to find a way to be true to himself. But at the end of the day, he's spending $100 million and counting, which shows that, to quote Kendrick Lamar, they not like us. You know what I mean?
He's up to $111 million plus and counting.
111 and counting. But the other thing I was going to say about Rick Jackson is I find it interesting because you would think that someone who has a background in healthcare is going to talk about things like Medicaid expansion, access to abortion, particularly when it comes to the decisions doctors make in an emergency. He can talk about people needing a working wage, particularly those in the service industry, like your nurses and your assistants, medical assistants, hourly hospital workers, elder care, like a lot of these social services and safety net programs that he has intimate knowledge of because he owns a healthcare company. But he has indicated that he will take a more conservative approach than maybe what you would expect from someone who has a background in healthcare. But to me, I'll be interested to see how he talks about those issues.
Yeah, to me, he reads as somebody who considers himself as being a with a background in business more than a background in healthcare. He's not in the trenches of hospitals, for example. He does staff hospitals and does a number of ancillary services for hospitals and for doctors and doctors' offices. He tells a story quite a bit on the campaign trail about buying a company that manufactured antibiotics because it was the last American manufacturer of antibiotics. Otherwise, it would have been an entirely Chinese supply chain. And that was what he said. That was just a huge problem during COVID. And I'd lost money on that deal, but I thought it was worthwhile. So he addresses those issues, Tia, more as sort of like the executive talking about them rather than the doctor right there having these conversations with patients. But I think it could actually be an opportunity for him. He didn't talk about that a lot. Democrats certainly haven't had a chance to push him on all of those issues either that you mentioned, Tia. So I think that'll be a fascinating piece of this campaign. One other thing I wanted to mention, and this is a bit of a left turn, but getting back to President Trump and Rick Jackson, it always felt to me that President Trump, had he had his druthers and two people to choose from, might have picked Rick Jackson in the first place instead of Burt Jones. Rick Jackson is a billionaire who made his own money, and Burt Jones was a wealthy person whose father made a lot of money. And I think that Trump probably sees a lot of himself in Jackson, even though he didn't come up from his bootstraps. Jackson is just so incredibly successful. He has that level of success that the president is drawn to and is impressed by, just this immense wealth. And he started penniless. And so I thought the speed of his reaction to the Rick Jackson win was very sincere. It felt like he's been waiting to say that for a long time. And he gave the guy $1 million Rick Jackson gave to Trump. So I think that made him have more affection for him as well.
Yeah, and probably more since then. I mean, we know he was at this big MAGA Inc. fundraiser benefiting Trump and his political operation, Trump National, the Saturday before the runoff. That also showed you the priority that Rick Jackson put on meeting with Donald Trump. You know, he had some events planned on Saturday, scrapped those to go see the president at Trump National. We covered this throughout the campaign, which was essentially Rick Jackson saw it as a win. Not that, no one expected the president to back off his endorsement of Burt Jones. Burt Jones didn't give him any reason to. He was always a MAGA loyalist. He was one of the first state officials who endorsed the president. And there was very little indication or likelihood of a double endorsement, which is what he's done in South Carolina and some other states. But Rick Jackson always took it as a win that the president didn't insult him. Yeah. That said, hey, this guy, I don't know about these other guys.
Rick Jackson.
Yeah, I didn't do like small hand Rick or anything like that. It was all about, positive towards Burt Jones, never negative towards Rick Jackson. And that was telling as well, Tia.
Yeah. And I want to point out, you mentioned he had a scheduling conflict and he canceled some events to remove the conflict so he can go to the MAGA Inc. dinner. But he had scheduling conflicts that kept him from going to the GOP rodeo. I'm just saying, scheduling conflicts. So again, we don't know what those scheduling conflicts were, but there is evidence that he can clear up the conflict when he so chooses. But what you're saying, Greg, makes sense that, in some ways it was a win that when the Trump endorsed candidate needed help, yes, Trump held tele-rallies, nothing in person, but tele-rallies. He did reiterate his support for Burt Jones. He did not attack Rick Jackson, which does say something about, if nothing else, there's a level of respect for Rick Jackson's, respect for him as a person or respect for the strength of his campaign that the president did not go there. And I do think that's worth pointing out. And I do think you're right. There's a lot in Rick Jackson's story that I think Trump does like, because again, he likes to bet on people he perceives as winners. And what's more winning than coming from nothing to becoming a billionaire? I do want to say, though, to your point, if we're talking about rich guys who got started or was boosted by their dad's wealth, Donald Trump's story more closely aligns with Burt Jones than it does a Rick Jackson. So I think that's
Good
important.
point.
You know, Donald Trump doesn't like to talk about that, but he, again, his dad was wealthy and basically passed on the family business, or at least the family trade, onto Donald Trump, who then built upon it. But yes, Donald Trump and Burt Jones have very similar origin stories, except for there's no evidence that Donald Trump's dad is the one who financed his run for the president. At that point, Donald Trump had enough of his own money to do it himself.
And funny, when we talk about $26 million or so as being the small potato in a race where Rick Jackson at least $111 million so far. That's just on the campaign finance disclosures. There's other independent expenditures, and there's, of course, that shadowy anonymous group that spent more than $20 million softening the ground by attacking Burt Jones. Okay, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our channel. And please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. You can also follow the Politically Georgia podcast on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast platform. Wherever you're listening, we always appreciate your comments, your ratings, your reviews, your feedback. PoliticallyGeorgia@ajc.com or Patricia.Murphy@ajc.com. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.